Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you and welcome to Justice Starts at Home. This is the plenary session for Connecticut's Coalition and Homelessness Housing Equals Justice Annual Training Institute and Conference 2020. I'm very excited about this particular panel where we are going to have a very rich conversation about the ways that criminal justice, policing, housing, homelessness, and residential segregation are all related. And we have a really amazing set of panelists here today. If we can move to the next slide. As you all know, those of you who have been with us all week, we've been holding a week-long conference entitled Housing Equals Justice. This is our annual conference on homelessness. It's actually our 18th year holding this event. And this year's theme, Housing Equals Justice, really centers on the idea that homelessness is an issue of racial justice, economic justice, and also criminal justice. And I think all of those themes will be touched on this particular panel today. But throughout the week, we've had a number of conversations on everything from I learned a new term yesterday, the syndemic of COVID-19, systemic racism and homelessness. That's the synergistic epidemics that we've been experiencing. We've had conversations on establishing a human right to housing here in Connecticut, a conversation on a crisis in the rental market, and today really hitting home on the ways that policing, mass incarceration, housing, and homelessness all intersect. Next slide. One thing I want to just plug quickly is that we do have a conference store where you can buy some great products that have the Housing Equals Justice logo. So if you want to show your support, we have mugs, face masks, t-shirts, actually, so you can buy yourself a t-shirt. We also have hoodies. So please do visit the cch.org ATI 2020 website, and you can find the link to the bonfire store where we're selling those products. And finally, I want to just send a note of thanks to our presenting sponsors, Bank of America and Zillow, who've made this possible not only to put on this event, but also to make it free of charge and open to the public. So with that, I'm going to now introduce Kellen Lyons, who is a reporter with Connecticut Mirror, with CT Mirror, which covers really a range of issues throughout our state. And Kellen has covered a beat that focuses on everything from criminal justice to mental health, housing, and homelessness. And so I'm really excited that Kellen will be moderating this discussion with you today. Kellen, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thanks for having me. I am here to moderate the panel. We have a rich discussion for you all today. So I'm going to jump right into background so we can get into questions, as many as we can. First off, we have Professor Monica C. Bell, an associate professor of law and sociology at Yale Law School. Her areas of expertise include law and inequality, policing and the criminal legal system, welfare and public benefits law, housing law, residential segregation, and race in the law. Her scholarship has appeared or is forthcoming in the Yale Law Journal, American Journal of Sociology, NYU Law Review, Law and Society Review, Harvard Civil Rights, Liberties Law Review, and other journals, and she's published writing in popular outlets such as the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Washington Post, and the Appeal. Representative Brandon L. McGee Jr. is a community activist and architect of social solutions for the people of Connecticut. He's serving his fourth term representing areas of Windsor and Hartford. He's the House Chairman of the Legislature's Housing Committee and the Chairman of the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus. Mark Pelka is the Undersecretary of Criminal Justice Policy and Planning at the Office of Policy and Management, which is an agency that provides information and analyses to formulate public policy for the state on the Governor of Lamont's behalf. His responsibilities rest at the intersection of criminal justice data analysis, policy development and implementation, administration of state and federal grants, and convenings of state and local officials, as well as stakeholders. Commissioner Angel Quiros started his career with the Connecticut Department of Corrections in 1989 as a correction officer, and he's gone on to work his way up through the agency from lieutenant, captain, unit manager, major, deputy warden, and warden. He was a district administrator from 2011 to 2019. He's also overseen the Parole and Community Service Division, and he was the interim commissioner of the department from July through August 20th. And then earlier last month, I believe, Governor Ned Lamont nominated Commissioner Quiros to be the 11th commissioner of the state's Department of Correction, and he will be the first Latino to serve as the commissioner of the state's prison system. And finally, Donald Whitehead Jr. is the executive director of the National Coalition for the Homeless. Donald's recognized as a leading expert on homelessness, having served as the executive director of the Greater Cincinnati Coalition for the Homeless, the assistant director at St. Vincent's de Paul of Baltimore, program director at Ohio Valley Goodwill, grant manager at Goodwill of Greater Washington, and director of communications at Greenpeace, Ohio. Donald served 2 terms as president of the board of directors for the National Coalition for the Homeless, 2 terms on the board of directors for Faces and Voices of Recovery, and 2 terms on the Georgetown Center for Cultural Competency. Thank you all for joining me today. Okay. Setting the stage, Mr. Whitehead, can you set the stage for us? How many people are experiencing homelessness in Connecticut? And are there specific parts of the state that have larger concentrations of homeless residents? And has that changed over the course of the pandemic so far?
So thank you so much, first of all, for the opportunity to be on such a distinguished panel. Thank you for all the work that the Connecticut Coalition does throughout the state. Your coalition is one of the coalitions around the country that does some of the best work when it comes to ending homelessness, and a lot of that I know can be attributed to great leadership from Richard Cho. So I just wanted to get that whole piece out. So numbers are really something that is more complicated than one would think when we talk about people, one in this country and also in any specific location. People are typically homeless more often in larger metropolitan areas, and that would be consistent in pretty much every state across the country. In the point in time count, which is a one-day count of people that are homeless in a particular community, Connecticut, the number that you all came up with was 3,033. And that's a one-day count in January of 2019. However, it's complicated because if you look at the numbers that come from the National Center on Homeless Education, they have a number that says that there's about 5,000 children that are homeless within the school system in Connecticut. It's really, really hard to count homeless people. The numbers that are counted don't include some very important populations. So that's a point in time count. The national count's about 550,000 or so. We believe it's considerably higher if you look at some of the people that aren't counted. So it's a very tough number to come up with. In terms of COVID, we're just starting to see those numbers. Homelessness has absolutely increased because of COVID-19. There are people who have lived on the margins. About 20 million Americans are rent burdened in this country. A lot of those people that are in that rent burden category, they have seen a loss of employment. Because of that, being on the margins has now become an issue of homelessness. Around the country, the economists that have looked at this issue think that we could see up to a 45% increase in homelessness across the country. I think in a lot of communities, Connecticut, I would say, is among those communities. We haven't really been able to see exactly what the impact is. So people are starting to gather those numbers through the HMIS data system. But we know for sure that we're seeing more people ask for rental assistance. We're seeing more people evicted across the country. This population has been impacted in a way that is much worse than it is for other people in the country, especially when it comes to minority groups within the homeless population.
Thank you. Mark, you've done research on the intersection between homelessness and incarceration. Can you give us some background on that overlap and give us a general sense as to if there are patterns in what those criminal charges are for, like if it's quality of life crimes or theft and such?
Thank you for the question. And I'm suddenly confronted by the reality of how hard it is to contribute to a discussion like this while remaining seated. It gives me greater appreciation for Senator Harris and VP Pence last night, because when you're passionate about a topic, it's hard to remain seated. And it's a thrill to be back at this conference. I remember last year at the convention center, quite a different set of circumstances. That was the time when we released fairly early stages of analysis that, as Kellen was asking about, we took data from the Department of Correction and matched it with anyone who had been admitted to a shelter across Connecticut. and found that half of people admitted to shelter had at one point been inside a Department of Correction facility. We probed a little deeper and found that actually 21% of the people admitted to shelter had exited DOC in the prior 3 years. So the first finding, that 50% match, showed that there was an overlap of incarceration and homelessness. The second, the deeper dive, showed that there's something more proximate between those two. When we delved into that matched population of people who had exited DOC and entered shelter, we found that it skewed heavily toward people receiving their first admission to DOC at a younger age. We found a 50-50 split between people admitted to DOC on a pretrial charge compared to a sentenced population. What was similar, though, is that both cohorts tended to exit DOC without supervision to follow. For the pretrial population, a larger share exited from the court, being unable to bond out. For the sentenced population, 4 out of 5 exited to no supervision, either an end of sentence, meaning they served their entire sentence behind bars and exited to no DOC supervision, or their sentence was so short that it was impossible to provide a period of supervision. So not only was that intersection apparent, we also saw a revolving door of sorts of short sentences in and out of the Department of Correction into shelter, and opportunities to really learn from each system, from housing and from corrections, to find a blended intervention to produce better outcomes for this population.
Thank you. Mr. Whitehead, your organization has said a lot about the criminalization of homelessness. Wouldn't some police departments argue that people who sleep outside or panhandle are breaking local laws? And could you respond to that view?
So that's a very interesting view, and I do think that over the course of my career, I've worked in every facet of homeless service delivery. So I've worked in outreach, I've worked as an executive director, a case manager, you name it. I've worked in every level of service. And what I've found at every level is, first of all, that police departments don't want to do this kind of work for the most part. I've been able to train police officers at the academy on dealing with homeless people, being able to recognize hypothermia, all different aspects of homelessness. And I do find that for the most part, they're actually very cooperative when it comes to helping get homeless people off the street, to the point where some of them will give people money, all kinds of things. So that's the first thing. I don't think that most police departments want to be involved in this kind of activity. Secondly, I don't believe that these are crimes that people are committing. Until there's no city in the entire United States where there's enough shelter to meet the needs of the population. Not one city in the entire United States. There's not one city where you can work a minimum wage job and still afford a place to live at the percentage of your income that the federal government says you should spend, 30%. The housing wage in Connecticut is about $26 an hour to be able to afford a 1-bedroom housing unit. So my point is that people that are homeless, and I've been doing this for almost 30 years now, I've never met someone who wants to be homeless. So people are forced to be homeless. And if you're forced to be on the street because there's not enough resources to provide for yourself, you have no other option than to either sleep on the street, sleep in a park, any of those things that are common factors in people being ticketed or arrested for homelessness. You have no other choice. If there were enough low barrier shelters where it didn't matter if you had severe mental health issues or if you had substance abuse issues, you could still enter that shelter, then there would be a reason for people to be able to be ticketed for these particular issues. You get tickets for biological things like using the restroom. Every person in this world has to use the restroom. If you don't have a restroom, we don't want to see people doing those kind of things outside, but they don't have another choice. We don't have public restrooms in communities, so people have to do that. And the big issue is that these particular crimes, and there's been an increase, a dramatic increase over the last several years of these kinds of ordinances. It even goes as far as banning people from feeding people in public. There's laws that say you can't walk across a parking lot unless you have a car in that parking lot. The biggest thing I want people to remember about criminalization, it does nothing to end homelessness. It actually exacerbates homelessness. It makes people less likely to get a job, less likely to get a house, and it's far more expensive than to provide a housing unit for those individuals. So if we had more health related resources like mobile crisis units that could reach a person with mental health issues and get them into a facility. If we had more housing, if we had the resources people need, they wouldn't have to do these things on the street. And if it's illegal to beg, which is one of the biggest, to ask people for money, the Salvation Army shouldn't get to do it, and no other nonprofit shouldn't get to do it. It's a violation of our First Amendment. Freedom of speech in this country is not illegal, and it shouldn't be illegal just because you're poor or homeless.
Thank you. Professor Bell, your research talks about the role that policing plays in enforcing residential segregation. Can you explain that function of policing and tell us what an anti-segregation approach to policing would look like in Connecticut?
Yeah, sure. So first, I just want to thank all of you for being a part of this conversation with me, and I'm grateful for the invitation to be in community with all of you. So in beginning to answer that question, I want to go back to a little bit of what Mr. Whitehead was saying a few minutes ago about like these aren't crimes, like all of these ordinances that give police authority to kind of manage people in public space are indicative of a much larger set of laws and ordinances that empower the maintenance of lines of residential segregation. And so in some of my work, I've talked about multiple, and so I kind of go through 6 different manifestations of how policing promotes or kind of pro-segregation policing. But in lieu of going through all 6 of them now, I want to highlight a couple. So one is has to do with the maintenance of lines between one neighborhood and the other. So this might sound theoretical, but it probably is really practical if you think about, so, you know, I live in New Haven. And the actual function of policing in a lot of places is to keep, so first of all, there's keeping people from New Haven outside of the bounds of Yale. So that's one mode in which the segregation lines are reinforced. And there's also keeping Black people largely out of neighborhoods like East Rock and in neighborhoods that are seen as more places where Black people belong. Now, this might sound sinister, but it actually has a lot to, it's kind of the regular way that policing operates. So when we think about the standards of suspicion, so when police get hunches about whether a person is out of place, so much of that, and there's a long history of research on this, is whether there's a person who seems racially out of place. That's the primary way in which police determine whether someone is where they're supposed to be. And this goes in multiple directions. So, I mean, you've heard the adage and the idea before that when there's a white person in a Black neighborhood, oh, they must be looking for drugs, they're probably up to something. And what should we think about that? It's associating Blackness with drug neighborhoods, and it's associating whiteness with being out of place. So that kind of routine maintenance of that boundary is a key way that policing promotes segregation. I don't want to take up too much time, so I want to get quickly to the last half of your question, which is about what an anti-segregation police approach would be like in Connecticut, where these issues are super live, like having lived in New Haven and in Bridgeport. So a few. So one is police often have meetings with concerned neighbors, and those concerned citizen types of meetings, and sometimes, and this also happens online, they're basically residents, often white affluent residents, complaining about people who look like they're not supposed to be there. This is a routine thing, you know, or people riding dirt bikes, or really whatever it is. And it's usually code for young people and young people of color. So one way of responding is a way that police usually respond, which is to amp up the enforcement in ways that powerful residents request. But another way of responding would be to engage in dialogue about what it is they're worried about. Like what actual, so is it the presence of people of color that it is concerned? Why are you assuming that they're going to engage in criminal activity? What is your evidence of that? Like actually playing that role of being a community leader and a civil servant by trying to break up these lines of segregation is a really important role that police can play. And finally, very quickly, so that's about using the platform to educate, but also very quickly, there are some police departments that know their communities well enough to say, okay, well, I know that call sounds like you're calling us because you think there's suspicious activity, but we know that actually this is just about the race of the person that's calling, because we know our community well enough to know who should be there and who shouldn't be. So this is something that's happened in Piedmont, California. I've written about it and I won't belabor the point here, but police and dispatchers could actually play a role in kind of not responding or responding more slowly to calls that seem to be grounded in racism. But I'll stop there, thanks.
Thank you. Representative McGee, what's the legislature's role in this? How can the legislature get police to take an anti-segregation approach to their work? And how can the legislature reduce the criminalization of homelessness?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I could sit and listen to the good professor all day. I am also excited to be here among really powerful people. Please excuse the noise in the background. We all share spaces at my job, so I'm in the cafeteria area. But to frame my portion of this conversation regarding criminal justice reform, which, much like any thoughtful discussion, we must address the historical context. So while it's true that Connecticut's inmate population is the lowest it has been in decades, the inequities of this criminal justice system have been on full display throughout the public health emergency. We have had regular protests outside the governor's mansion calling for the immediate release of inmates serving time for low-level offenses, as COVID-19 has devastated prison populations and family members worry about their health and well-being of relatives behind bars. As many of us here present know that there are an estimated 70 million adults, or 1 in 3 in the United States, living with a criminal record, many of whom are people within our own families, or are our parents, or people we know trying to make a difference, or most likely struggling to make a living in many of our neighborhoods throughout the state of Connecticut. Government and lawmakers like myself and others on this call have also paid close attention to this very population in terms of providing services or addressing the lack thereof of what formal and sometimes unneeded barriers to their reintegration in society currently exist. So as a matter of fact, myself along with others have led legislation-based research aimed at improving restrictive housing policies and also expanded reentry support services as Connecticut continues to lower recidivism, improve public safety, and shrink its prison population. But to get to your question, and for me, it's always important to tell a story so that folks can understand that we as a legislature have worked really hard to be inclusive throughout our journey in addressing some of the barriers that many of our justice impacted individuals are faced with. So we've conducted research, we've conducted listening tours, but one of the things that I really want to chime in, and then I'm going to be quiet because it seems like my colleagues are kind of competing with the noise in the background. We know, we confirm what we already knew, right? Which is basically Having a safe and stable place to live and employment are essential for families' successful reintegration. Research shows that if a person has a stable housing, they are less likely to commit a new crime and end up back behind bars again. Our number one goal as a legislature and as chairman of the Housing Committee in conjunction with the committees on Judiciary and Labor, our number one goal is to strengthen policies to prevent discrimination in both public and private housing and remove unnecessary barriers to housing access for individuals with a criminal record. All of you on this call, I know what we've been working on and some of the challenges that we face. We know Connecticut has a long way to go, but there was a report in 2016 that the Connecticut Office of Legislative Research report titled Updated Report, Housing for Adults with Criminal Records, made two policy recommendations. One, that Connecticut legislation prohibiting housing discrimination against individuals with criminal records. And then two, we should expand the role of certificates of employability. So again, we definitely know that we have a long way to go, but I wanted to share just a little bit of what we're doing. And there's a list of recommendations that we have, but the most popular, and I'll shut up after this, was the one policy recommendation that we reconsidered after a hard-fought legislation, or rather session, was from the Clean Slate movement, which the primary goal was to prohibit landlords from denying prospective renters solely on the basis of a criminal record. So essentially, still allowing housing owners to conduct a criminal background screening, but they would only be allowed to see convictions that occurred within the past decade or so. Restricting property owners from asking about criminal records on their applications. And then lastly, requiring landlords to complete an individualized assessment if they want to deny renting to someone with certain convictions. So I could probably talk on and on about what we're doing, but I do want to allow others an opportunity to speak.
Thank you. Commissioner Quiroz, you've been in the Department of Correction for 31 years. Can you talk about how the department's philosophies have changed over those 3 decades?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to sit with this powerful panel of professionals that we have, and definitely for bringing me on the table as a commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Correction to be part of the solution and have these difficult discussions. So as you indicated earlier, I did start as a correctional officer in 1989. So I've had a front row view for 3 decades, seen the change in the progression with the Department of Correction, particularly when dealing with this population. And I can remember as early as 1990 to 1993 being the admission and discharge officer, meeting these individuals, doing the intakes upon entry into the system, and then releasing them. And to be honest, there was not much that we did when it came to the, back in 1990, with the homeless population as far as discharge planning or anything like that. We wouldn't even take them, provide them with a ride to a shelter place for the shelter. So in the 1990s, it was pretty much lock them up, warehouse them, and when it's time to go, you don't worry about, if they're homeless or not. Then in 2003, when the Connecticut Department of Correction Commissioner Teresa Lance came into as a commissioner, moved our agency towards the reintegration back into the community, making sure that the offenders had the skill sets and the information they needed upon discharge. Then she, in 2006, every correctional facility under her leadership was assigned to reentry counselors. These reentry counselors still exist here today in the Department of Correction and play a very vital role engaging the communities and roundtables and particularly in the New Haven, Hartford, and Bridgeport area, and identifying those resources out there for this population. And then move into the 2015, 2016, and even here now in 2020, where the top priority for these reentry counselors is to make sure that they have identifications, when they discharge, which is a huge task for our staff, a huge task. Everybody knows that you can't even change a paycheck. You can't even go into a bank and cash a check without an ID. So it's such an important, critical piece that when I started, we didn't even address that issue. Addressing that issue now, making sure that the individual that's discharging nowadays is hooked up to a medical insurance. That we start the process for the offender to have medical insurance while they're incarcerated, so when they discharge, they go back into the community with medical coverage. COVID-19 was a challenge for every state agency across the country. As good as the Department of Correction is with a pandemic and having a framework, there was a lot of unknown with COVID-19, and the homeless population became a challenge for us. And we had to go back out into the community, out with the Coalition to End Homelessness, and pair up with them. I can remember at the peak of April 2020, when COVID hit Connecticut, I had correctional officers driving homeless individuals to shelters, to hotels. While driving to the hotel, stopping at CVS to pick up their the medicines for 2 weeks supplies. So we've come a long way in the Department of Correction with this population. There's still a lot of work ahead to be done with this population. State Rep McGee hit it on the nail. If you want this population to be successful, there has to be stable housing. There has to be employment. There has to be employment. And I'm gonna add one more. There has to be a commitment. There has to be a commitment from the individual to want to change. And then throw in the substance abuse problems and the mental health problems. So it is just there's a lot more to be done with this population. And again, I'm so happy to be part of the solution, be at the table to advocate for this population that I supervise that deserves an opportunity to go back into the community and be productive citizens of the state of Connecticut.
Thank you. Representative McGee, I've done some stories on panels that Richard Cho and Mark Pelka have been on regarding the collateral consequences of a criminal record. And some landlords in those groups had said that they'd be more willing to rent to folks with criminal records if it were easier to evict them, because they say it's an inherent risk to rent to somebody with a history of convictions. Can you respond to that and talk a little bit more about things the legislature could do to make landlords more willing to rent to individuals with criminal records?
Yeah, that's a really great question that you pose, and it's also a difficult one to respond to. And the reason I say that is it really requires a person to have a heart, and a heart that understands forgiveness, and also understands that the individual applying for housing has served their time, and now is interested in living a very successful life in our collective community. So, for me, it's all about education, and obviously hearing the voices of many of our private landlords. And just to clarify, we know much of our public housing stock is very restrictive in terms of providing opportunities for justice impacted individuals. So it's really our private landlords. And I am a private landlord. And I always tell people, I'm a part of that community that has to have that heart, right? And obviously we want to make sure our most vulnerable are protected, like our young children, our elderly, et cetera. And so, we want our private landlords to have an opportunity to look back into one's criminal history, right? But at what point do we say, that was 45 years ago, and as a matter of fact, you were 15, and how do we get over that? And so it's forced me, alongside many other stakeholders, like the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, Mark Pelka, our commissioner, and others, to take a hard look at innovation and how do we take a step back to really recalibrate and understand what creative ways can we provide many of our folks who are returning home an opportunity to live in quality housing. So I always look to places like New Haven and other places where housing authorities have actually done this. But there's not an easy way around this. And I know that one, using the commissioner, his words, we have to be committed. And I just don't feel the state of Connecticut, and this is no slight against the Lamont administration or even our commissioner, the current commissioner, but we all collectively have to understand the importance of investment. And if y'all want to talk dollars, we can talk dollars, right? On how much money can be saved if we only invest in this vulnerable population. So hopefully that answers your question, but it's a very difficult question to respond to.
Thank you. Professor Bell, I'm wondering if this question of landlord bias figures into your research at all. Can you talk about how that can contribute to residential segregation in Connecticut?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you. And I kind of want to pick up on a theme from Representative McGee's conversation, which is landlords having a heart. But I think we need to be clear about what that heart is. It's a heart for justice and to not reproduce racial hierarchy in Connecticut. And this is very specific. And there are ways, actually, so if we think back to HUD in toward the end of the Obama administration, HUD actually tried to make not discriminating against people with criminal records part of fair housing and part of fair housing regulations. And the reason for that is that because we understand that, frankly, how people get criminal records, especially in very segregated states like Connecticut, is by being a person of color. That's largely determinative of how much contact people have with police, and especially given the expansion of criminal law and some of the ordinances that Mr. Whitehead was talking about. I mean, there is just a way that all of that data that we're learning about people, about examining their records, is heavily racialized. And so that's what landlords need to have a heart of concern about in particular. So how does this matter? So there are various ways that that landlord action reproduces segregation. So, while it is true that there are many private landlords who do not rent to people with criminal records, depending on the nature of the criminal record, there are people who routinely rent to people with criminal records, slumlords in depressed and segregated areas. That's who actually gets people. And so what that does is just reproduce not just the racial segregation, but also the disinvestment. Because think about where slumlords are able to operate. And then there's another piece of this, which I'll just quickly mention before moving on, which is when people coming out of prison can't get housing, they often have to resort to relying on friends and family, especially mothers and sisters, according to the research. Now, if they're living in private housing, there are, it might kind of invite them to subvert some of what the landlord is expecting. So it puts them into a situation of being out of sync with what the landlord wants. And when we start talking about housing vouchers and public housing, they can actually be violating terms of their contract in ways that could jeopardize their access to resources. So these are all multiple really deep ways that landlords' action on something like how they examine a criminal record is part of a domino effect that reproduces all the segregation we see.
Got it. Thank you. I'm going to weave in a question from audience members here. Jessica had asked, how impactful have you found the certificate of employability to be for landlords? And anybody can pick that up.
Hi, this is Mark, just jumping in to say that, certificates of employability was an intervention, that was an opportunity that was created for both a judicial branch and the parole board to acknowledge someone's efforts toward rehabilitation. It provides some benefits when it comes to pursuing some regulations, but it seems that when employers and landlords have been asked about the certificate, it's been unclear to them about what that actually accomplishes. And when it comes to conversations with employers, we've heard that they would much benefit from seeing efforts that the applicant has taken to build up their professional experience. For example, someone who was incarcerated in the Department of Corrections, but participated in many of the manufacturing programs or other employment opportunities in there, actually enable someone to demonstrate that during this period of incarceration, they took every step they could to build up an employment record to make them an attractive candidate on the outside. Part of a term that Dr. Bell used was the expansion of criminal law, and I think that helps to underscore the impetus that brought about clean slate legislation that was introduced last session, that tens of thousands of new charges are added to people's records in Connecticut in a given year, and 3/4 of them are misdemeanors, and many of them are low-level misdemeanors. Yet, because of record retention requirements, that charge remains on someone's record for 100 years. That record will follow you into your grave if a background check is conducted. We have in Connecticut, fortunately, an automated process for a arrest that does not lead to a conviction. For example, if it's acquitted or dismissed, it's automatically erased from your record, but nothing exists when it comes to an actual conviction. And I've learned a lot about criminal justice policy over the years, and I wouldn't expect to foist that onto a landlord or an employer who's running a background check and is suddenly confronted with all these terms that you cannot pick up on by watching Law and Order or NCIS. And also a background check in a criminal record is not a risk assessment. As we heard earlier from Representative McGee, records capture all the way back, many cases, into your juvenile experience, depending on the charge that you had, certainly well beyond 10 years. And so for someone who's trying to review someone's eligibility for housing or employment, that record can exceed all of the other information that's available there. And so I really applaud the efforts in the legislature through the leadership of Senator Kushner and Representative Porter with the Collateral Consequences Council, the work that Rep. McGee is doing in the Housing Committee, because issues of employment and housing are very similar. And there is no single intervention that will address the historical, societal inequity and racism that exists in our society. So that's the reason why there's so many different bills and initiatives that came forward last session. And I really want to add one more to the list of the impact this has on disparities in our criminal justice system and housing and so many other systems. That if you look at the resident population of Connecticut, white people comprise about 7 out of 10, and the remaining 3 out of 10 are people of color. If you look at the Department of Correction population, it's actually flipped, that white people comprise about 30% and non-white people comprise the remainder. When we did the match of people who have been admitted to shelter and have been incarcerated, the disparities are clear. It's triple the percentage of a composition of Black people of the resident population compared to that cohort. And for the DOC population overall, it's 4 times as large. So I'm trying to figure out how can we provide the data analysis to back up what is a lived experience of people who come to the legislature or to forums like this and share their personal experiences and weave in narratives and cases of people, because this is something that's a bit lost for me sitting in an office looking at a screen, as I can't see all the housing service providers from across our state who are here today. And I recognize that every data point that I provide consists of individual experiences of people that you have served and sought to make lives better for. So I think the question that came forward, it raises a crucial point of how can we make sure that our interventions don't just feel good, but they actually have impact.
Thank you. Mark, you mentioned clean slate. This question could be for either you or Representative McGee, but how does the legislature or the governor's office, how do you guys balance the time period that are proposed for a clean slate legislation? I know that research is showing that folks are less likely to be arrested if they have access to housing and employment, but that's those are limitations imposed on them if they have a criminal record. Can you talk a little bit about that challenge of trying to balance a shorter versus a larger window before someone is available for clean slate?
Absolutely, and that conversation was beginning in the legislature. Sorry, Brett McGee, I feel like I just jumped right in. Maybe I had my button off. So.
I think I'll wait to hear what you'll say, and then I'll just support it because that's the direction we'll go.
Sorry, sir. I'm getting carried away here when I can control my mute button. I'm dodging the sun over here. So it's a nice backdrop, sir. There, and I will never. It broke my heart that I think the very last Judiciary Committee public hearing held in the Connecticut General Assembly in this year was on clean slate. It was within, I think actually the reductions in room capacity were introduced by the governor that very day. And given the energy behind the bill, we probably broke what the governor's executive order had been that day regarding capacity. And the governor wanted to introduce a bill and provide funding in his proposed budget to get the conversation moving on clean slate because he recognized the impact that a record has on someone's ability to attain employment and housing, education, and services. And Senator Winfield and Representative Stastrom and many of their colleagues in the General Assembly introduced a separate bill on clean slate. So we had two bills that were received in public hearings on a given day, and the discussion went on for the course of the day and would have continued, I believe, in the remainder of the legislative session to find a compromise agreement. States have taken the steps on clean slate. It looks like Michigan recently joined the array of states, pantheon of states that have done clean slate. I brought it up because a record appears when a background check is conducted. And I think the details will need to be worked out when the session reconvenes on the length of time before the automated erasure occurs in clean slate, eligible felony and misdemeanor classes, types of offenses, whether that record is sealed or actually erased. So Connecticut made a lot of progress on its legislation before the end of the legislative session of figuring out how to actually operationalize these changes. So I'm not surprised that a member of the audience was interested in hearing where we're at, and I think that this will be a topic that will be revisited in the upcoming session.
Representative McGee, do you have anything you wanna add?
No, I think Mark pretty much described sort of the evolution of all of our efforts and where we are. I will say this, I do believe the 119 participants minus the 6 or 7 of us, they would like to see something happen, right? And I'm encouraging them to push as far as you can go to ensure that people have an opportunity, specifically around housing, have access to it. Because we should not be talking about this some 10 years now about studies and the impacts. Like, we know what the answer is. So I would just add that to what Mark has said.
Thank you. Commissioner Quiros, can you talk about the role that the Department of Correction plays in this? I know that the DOC releases about 50 or 60 people at the end of their sentence to homelessness every month. Has that increased during the pandemic? And what's the DOC's role in helping incarcerated folks to get housing before they're out?
We have a huge role in this with this population. You did mention during the peak April of 2020, we did have to assist about 60 offenders that were identified as homeless, nowhere to go. At that time, we were reducing the shelter's capacity by 50%. We're moving individuals from the shelters to hotels. I had my reentry counselors working on first shift, second shift, with each individual, contacting family members, contacting friends, looking at the visiting list, looking at the phone list, see who we could contact to see if there could be a home for this individual. Some individuals took us to the last minute of the discharge to find them a home. And not only did we find them a home, we made sure that the transportation was not an issue. Wherever that home was going to be, we transported the individuals to the hotels. Like I said before, I even had officers going to CVS to pick up the medication with the offender. The average month now is down probably 20 to 25%. 20 to 25 individuals at the end of the month. It continues to be a challenge with COVID-19 and the restrictions out there, and more people ending up in shelters and homelessness because of the economic fallback. The one population that we tend to struggle with the homelessness is that unsentenced population, is that individual that is sitting in the county jail that we do know when the court date is going to be, but we do not know what the judge is going to decide. And that population ends up going to court. The judge gives him time served, and he or she now is out in Hartford, New Haven, Bridgeport, and it appears that here we go again. The Department of Corrections is not doing anything with the homelessness. So that is a huge piece that we're going to tackle, the Department of Correction, with this population, to include the unsentenced population. For many years, we focused on the sentenced population, but we need to focus on the unsentenced population, regardless of if we don't know their outcome is going to be when they go to court, to make sure that they have the pipeline, the referral to the resources that are out there, and following that individual, not just once the marshal comes to transport the individual to court, getting in contact with the court, with somebody from the public defender's office, the prosecutor's office, what's going to be the outcome, so that we can play a critical role with the unsentenced population in finding them home.
Thank you. I'm Representative McGee, do you have something to add?
Actually, I have another meeting to attend, and I didn't want to just shut my video off and leave. And you all thinking, man, that man got Boost Mobile or something. But I just, I do want to say this. Thank you for your great moderation or facilitation of today's discussion. Angel, Donald, Mark, and Dr. Bell, thank you so very much for this opportunity to participate. I told Richard in the chat, I said there needs to be a part 2 of this conversation so that we can dive even deeper and really just share some more thoughts on the subject matter. So again, thank you so much. Unfortunately, I gotta go. Part-time legislature, full-time job. So talk to you guys later. Take care.
Yeah, thank you. Turning to a question from Melvin Medina. He is talking about how there's a large movement in Connecticut to establish a rights-based framework independent of a service-oriented approach that isn't intended to compete with but run parallel policy solutions. He's asking to hear panelists' views on the difference between a rights-based movement to secure quality housing for justice-impacted folks versus a service-oriented one. Anybody wants to jump in, feel free.
Well, so I can jump in really quickly. The National Coalition was founded on civil rights issues. And we believe that there is a fundamental right to housing in this country and a right to shelter. We actually were able to get that done in New York City. And we believe since then that the United States, the richest country in the history of the world, should have a right to shelter everywhere in this country. And that includes the entire population. If people are leaving the justice system, there should be a place for them to go. The numbers that you talked about in Connecticut are pretty similar to the number in the United States. About 15% of the population that's in prison or in jail were homeless at one time. And many of those people will be homeless once they leave jail because they're not eligible to housing. So they should have a place to go. We hear anecdotal stories about people being released to bridges and parks and such. And we don't believe that, again, that should happen in the United States of America. And I'll be brief. I know we don't have much time left, so we would certainly support the additional resources. And we do believe that there should be a right to housing in the United States.
Professor Bell, I saw you nodding your head. Do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'll be super quick, which is to say the core value of a rights-based framework is to respect the agency of people who are living outside, right? So I mean, so much of the service-based framework dehumanizes people and treats them like problems rather than, human beings with rights. There are some drawbacks though. If you spend a lot of time arguing to achieve a right, then there's a larger debate about what should the right include? Who should have access to the right? So you could say, okay, well, people without criminal records, they're rights bearers, but people with criminal records, maybe they don't deserve the fullness of that right. So basically, a rights-based approach is so important for humanization, but it also introduces a number of different problems. So, but I strongly support that framework.
This is Mark just jumping in and thanking Mel for his question. It was the work of legislators from across the spectrum and advocates that worked to prohibit discrimination based on a criminal record. That effort led to the creation of a collateral consequences council that consisted of multiple subgroups, one of which Dr. Cho chaired, another on housing, as you would imagine, another of which I chaired on employment. And then the third was chaired by Andrew Clark from the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy. So I think coursing through that effort was the rights-based approach. And the effort was to see how we can convene people in around the gravity of that question while seeing what additional recommendations we can bring forward. And through that discussion, we identified that the need to support people with building up kind of job training and employment, vocational services to succeed in the workplace if that right is achieved and they access employment. I think the same goes across for the barriers to housing. Number two was engaging employers and landlords. We wanted to demonstrate we were listening carefully to those individuals, those stakeholders. And what employers indicated, similar to landlords, is a desire to have the tools to do an individualized assessment. So I believe these all can go hand in hand. And the reason why I'm optimistic is that the COVID-19 pandemic has introduced grave challenges, quite literally, to our country and to our state and to our communities. And during that incredibly challenging initial months of the period, the Department of Correction, the Coalition to End Homelessness stepped forward to address the issue of intersections between homelessness and incarceration. OPM administered a federal grant that provided funding to this effort to provide for earlier identification of people at risk of exiting DOC to homelessness and help to support a softer landing for people hitting their end of sentence state and returning to the community by having rapid rehousing. That means short-term rental assistance, a landlord willing to rent, help with utilities and getting set up, ability for that individual to get connected to employment, to telehealth services and more. And I am optimistic because if that can be accomplished during those initial months of the pandemic through coordination between corrections and homelessness providers, housing service providers, that bodes well for the future. And I hope that the findings from that effort can be merged in with broader efforts in the legislature next session.
Can I be real quick just to add a couple of things? I know we're short of time. So as a commissioner, I don't get to choose who comes in my front door, but I have a responsibility and a duty to find the funding to make sure that that we fund these individuals, in particular this group with the homelessness. And I will tell you that in my budget, I got like $4.5 million scatter sites, 189 apartments through the state of Connecticut that we house individuals short-term, 3 to 4 months, that are in a halfway house to get them stable in the housing. That's the kind of a model that we need to use with this population. And it's my job to find the fundings that to deal with this population so that we can increase the scatter siting beds and apartments across the state of Connecticut so that we can address this population.
Well, thank you all so much. I'm getting the signal to turn it back around, but I have a million questions that I wanted to ask. We got through a decent number of mine, but I could keep this going all day. So I wanted to thank all of you for your expertise and lending us your wisdom. So I'm going to turn it back over to Richard, but thanks so much.
Thank you so much. I want to echo that. My thanks to the panelists for all of that. I feel like I could have listened here for the rest of the day. And Kellen, thank you so much for your expert moderation. I think Representative McGee sent us a challenge that we should do a part 2. And if I could, I may actually put you on the spot to say I'd love to try to figure out how to do that at some point. But for now, I really want to thank you. This was, I think we just scratched the surface, but at the same time, ironically covered so much ground as well. And just, and I was live tweeting from your session and just captured how much these issues are intersected. And Dr. Bell, in particular, your idea that residential segregation is what drives the over-policing that leads to mass incarceration, that then leads people to have criminal records, that then subsequently leads them to have housing denials on the basis of that criminal record, and how that cycle persists. It's just that image is in my mind. So thank you for all of your words, and for all of you for your leadership at the national level, at the state level as well. Sadly, we have to close this session out, but want to segue actually into our next session, which actually is going to focus on some of the initiatives that Commissioner Quiros mentioned, which is a session on shutting the revolving door, which we'll talk about the new reentry housing assistance program that CCH worked in partnership with Department of Corrections and Office of Policy Management to stand up, and our own Deputy Director, Dr. Mimi Haley, will be presenting on that session. We also have at 2 o'clock a session on our new Mayor's Homelessness Prevention Task Force that CCH has initiated in partnership with the Connecticut Conference on Municipalities. At 3 o'clock, don't miss the session on how to build community for people with disabilities. I promise it will be inspiring as well as thought-provoking. And then at 4 o'clock, we have a great virtual ice cream social with our Be Homeful ambassadors. Those are the young people who are actually stepping up to assist in raising awareness around understanding homelessness. So thank you so much again to our panelists, and we'll close this session out. Please do join the next session, Shutting the Revolving Door. Thank you so much.